The jacket hung on a wire hanger in the back corner of the estate sale warehouse. Brown leather cracked like dried riverbeds. The sheepskin collar matted and yellowed with age. Nobody had touched it in 3 hours. Captain Alistair Black died alone in a veterans' nursing home outside Richmond, Virginia. No family, no visitors in his final 2 years. When the state cleared his room, they found almost nothing. A few books, reading glasses with one lens missing, and this jacket. The bomber, A2 style. World War II era, maybe. Or a replica. Hard to tell under decades of neglect. The auctioneer, a thick-necked man named Garrett with sweat stains spreading under his arms, lifted the jacket by one shoulder and held it toward the sparse crowd like a dead animal. All right, folks, lot 73. Vintage leather flight jacket. Belonged to the deceased. Any interest? Do I hear $5? Silence. $3. A woman in the front row wrinkled her nose. Garrett sighed, his patience thinning. Come on now. Leather's leather. Someone give me $2. Nothing. He lowered the jacket, shaking his head. All right. This one's going in the discard pile. Moving on to... Wait. The voice came from the back. Young. Uncertain. Garrett squinted past the overhead lights. You bidding, son? Julian Reeves stood up slowly, his backpack slung over one shoulder, notebook in hand. 22 years old. Graduate student in military history at the University of Virginia. He'd come to the sale looking for letters, documents, anything that might help with his thesis on forgotten veterans of the European theatre. He hadn't expected much, but something about that jacket. Can I see it? Julian asked, stepping forward. Garrett shrugged and tossed it to him. Julian caught it, surprised by the weight. Heavier than it looked. The leather was stiff, almost petrified, but the stitching along the seams was tight, military grade. He turned it over in his hands, inspecting the cuffs. The zipper, original brass, tarnished green. Then he felt it. A bulge, subtle, inside the lining, near the left chest. His fingers traced the shape through the cracked leather. Not a wallet, not keys, something flat, rectangular. You buying or fondling? Garrett called out, drawing a few chuckles from the crowd. Julian looked up. How much? You serious? How much? Garrett scratched his jaw. Tell you what, kid, give me $10 and it's yours. I was about to trash it anyway. Julian pulled a crumpled bill from his pocket and handed it over. Garrett waved him off, already moving to the next lot. Julian walked out of the warehouse with the jacket folded under his arm, his heart beating faster than it should. He didn't know why, not yet. Back in his apartment, Julian spread the jacket across his desk under the glow of a single lamp. The leather smelled like dust and old smoke, faint traces of something else. Cologne, maybe, or sweat long dried. He ran his hand along the interior lining, feeling for the bulge again. There, he pulled a small pair of scissors from his drawer and carefully cut a few stitches along the inner seam, just enough to slip his fingers inside. The lining was silk, faded olive green, standard issue for bomber jackets, but underneath, sewn directly into the leather itself, was another layer. He worked slowly, peeling back the fabric, and then he saw it. A piece of cloth, thin, delicate, folded multiple times and stitched into the jacket's core, like a secret the leather had been sworn to keep. Julian's hands trembled as he pulled it free. It was silk, old silk, the kind that frays at the edges. He unfolded it carefully, spreading it flat on the desk. At first, he didn't understand what he was looking at. The fabric was printed with text, faded but still legible. English on one side, Chinese characters on the other, and at the top, an American flag, hand-stitched in thread that had once been red, white and blue, but now looked rust-colored and grey. A blood chit. Julian's breath caught. Blood chits were issued to Allied pilots during World War II, especially those flying over Asia and Europe. If a pilot was shot down in enemy or neutral territory, the chit identified them as American military and promised a reward to anyone who helped them return safely. It was a lifeline, a plea sewn into fabric. But this one was different. There were stains on it, dark smudges along the edges, and in the center, just below the printed text, someone had written something in ink. Coordinates: 4346N, 11 to 15. Julian grabbed his phone and typed the numbers into a map application. Florence, Italy. His pulse quickened. Below the coordinates, in the same careful handwriting, were 3 more words. She showed me. And beneath that, barely visible, a smear of red. Not blood. Lipstick. Julian sat back in his chair, staring at the chit under the lamplight. His mind raced. Captain Alistair Black. World War II. Florence. A blood chit hidden inside a jacket for over 70 years. Why? He opened his laptop and searched the name. Nothing came up at first, just a few generic obituaries, a mention in a veterans registry. No service record, no medals, no story. He tried a different angle, searched for American pilots in Florence during the war, found dozens of names but none matched. He cross-referenced bombing missions, rescue operations, prisoner exchanges. Still nothing. Then he found a forum, a niche corner of the internet dedicated to World War II aviation history. Someone had posted a question 3 years ago. Does anyone know anything about a Captain A. Black who flew B-24s over Italy in 1944? I found his name in my grandfather's journal, but can't find any official records. No replies. Julian clicked on the user's profile. Inactive since 2021. He leaned closer to the screen, reading the original post again. B-24s, heavy bombers, long-range missions deep into occupied Europe. Florence, in 1944, was still under German control. The Allies were pushing north, but the city itself was a battleground. Art, history, and war colliding in the streets. And then Julian remembered something. A lecture from his freshman year. A professor talking about looted art during World War II, how the Nazis systematically stripped museums, churches, private collections, how thousands of pieces were never recovered, how some of them were rumored to be hidden in Florence. He looked back at the blood chit, at the coordinates, at the lipstick stain. She showed me. Who was she? And what did she show him? Julian didn't sleep that night. He pulled every book he had on World War II Italy, cross-referencing dates, locations, known Nazi art depots. The coordinates pointed to a specific address in Florence, a building that no longer existed, bombed in 1944, rebuilt after the war as an apartment complex. But in the archives, he found a photograph, the building before the bombing, a narrow stone structure with arched windows. And beneath the photo, a caption, former residence of the Conti family, seized by German forces 1943, used as temporary storage for confiscated assets. Confiscated assets. Art. Julian's hands shook as he zoomed in on the image. There, in the corner of the photograph, barely visible, a woman standing in the doorway, young, dark hair, looking directly at the camera. He couldn't see her face clearly, but something about her posture, the way she stood, defiant, even in a photograph meant to document occupation. He printed the image and pinned it to the wall above his desk, next to the blood chit. Then he went back to the jacket. He examined every inch of it, the pockets, the seams, the collar, and there, stitched into the inside of the right cuff, he found something else. Initials, AB plus MC, carved into the leather with a knife. Crude but deliberate. MC. Maria Conti? Julian grabbed his phone and searched the name. Found a genealogy site, a family tree, the Conti family of Florence, old money, art collectors, and there, Maria Conti, born 1921, died 1944. Died. Julian's stomach turned. He clicked on her name. No details, just a date. September 12th, 1944. The same month the Allies liberated Florence. He called the National Archives the next morning, explained what he'd found. The jacket, the blood chit, the coordinates. The woman on the phone was polite but skeptical. "Sir, we get calls like this all the time. People find old military items and think they've uncovered some great mystery. Most of the time it's just, 'I have coordinates,'" Julian interrupted. "And a name. Maria Conti, Florence, 1944. I think Captain Black was involved in something the military didn't document." A pause. "Hold on." He waited. 5 minutes. 10. Then a different voice came on the line. Older. Male. Authoritative. "This is Dr. Raymond Holt, Senior Archivist. You said you have a blood chit with coordinates?" "Yes." "And you believe it's connected to looted art?" "I do." Another pause. "Send me everything you have. Photos, documents, the chit itself if you're willing. I'll look into it." Julian hung up and immediately photographed everything. The jacket, the chit, the initials, the printed image of the building. He sent it all in an email, then sat back and waited. 3 days later, Dr. Holt called him back. "Mr. Reeves, I need you to come to Washington." The National Archives building in Washington, D.C. was colder than Julian expected. Dr. Holt met him in the lobby, a tall man in his 60s with wire-rimmed glasses and a face that looked like it had seen too many secrets. "Follow me." They walked through security, down a long hallway, into a room lined with filing cabinets and old computers. Dr. Holt gestured to a chair. "Sit." Julian sat. Dr. Holt opened a folder and slid a photograph across the table. It was the same building Julian had found online, but this photo was different, taken from a different angle, and in the foreground, standing next to a military jeep, was a man in a leather bomber jacket. Young, clean-shaven, smiling. Captain Alistair Black, Dr. Holt said. Officially, he flew 12 missions over Italy between March and August 1944. Officially, he returned stateside in September and was discharged in 1945. Officially, Dr. Holt pulled out another document, heavily redacted, stamped with classifications Julian didn't recognize. Unofficially, Captain Black went AWOL in Florence for 3 weeks in September 1944. No explanation, no court-martial. When he resurfaced, he was reassigned stateside immediately, and his service record was sealed. Why? Dr. Holt leaned back. That's what I'm hoping you can help me figure out. He slid another photograph across the table. A woman, dark hair, standing in front of the same building. Maria Conti. Julian's heart stopped. She was a resistance fighter, Dr. Holt said quietly. Worked with the Allies to smuggle information out of Florence. And according to this, he tapped the document. She was also the daughter of one of Italy's most prominent art collectors. The Nazis took her family's collection, Julian said. They took everything. Paintings, sculptures, manuscripts. Most of it was never recovered. Dr. Holt pulled out one more document. A list. Handwritten. Faded. This was found in a German officer's quarters after the liberation of Florence. It's an inventory. Pieces stored in that building. The one at your coordinates. Julian scanned the list. His eyes widened. Caravaggio, Botticelli, Donatello. Millions of dollars. Billions in today's market. None of it was ever found, Dr. Holt said. The building was bombed 2 days after this list was made. Everything inside was assumed destroyed. But it wasn't. Dr. Holt looked at him. Maria Conti died the same day that building was bombed, and Captain Black disappeared 3 days later. Julian's mind raced. She showed him where it was. Before the bombing. She got him inside. Dr. Holt nodded slowly. That's my theory. But if he knew where the art was, why didn't he report it? Julian thought about the lipstick stain, the initials carved into the jacket. Because he loved her. If you believe every life holds a story worth remembering, subscribe to this channel and join our community. Dr. Holt arranged for a team: historians, art recovery specialists, ground-penetrating radar technicians. They flew to Florence 2 weeks later. Julian went with them, the jacket still in his possession, the blood chit now sealed in an archival sleeve. The coordinates led them to the rebuilt apartment complex. The current owners were cooperative, intrigued by the possibility of history buried beneath their home. The radar team set up their equipment in the basement, scanned the floors, the walls, and then they found it. A void, 10 feet below the foundation, a space that shouldn't exist. They brought in excavation equipment, carefully removed layers of concrete and rubble, and 3 days later, they broke through. A room, small stone walls, sealed shut for 79 years. And inside, crates, dozens of them. Julian stood at the edge of the excavation site, staring down into the hole, his breath fogging in the cold Italian air. Dr. Holt climbed down first, pried open the first crate, and pulled out a painting, a Caravaggio, undamaged, perfect. The recovery took weeks. Every piece on the list was there, hidden, protected, waiting. The story broke internationally. Headlines in every language. Lost art found beneath Florence. War II, veteran secret saves billions in stolen masterpieces. The jacket that rewrote history. Julian was interviewed by every major news outlet. He told them about the jacket, the blood chit, the coordinates, Maria Conti, Captain Alistair Black. But he didn't tell them everything. He didn't tell them about the letter he found sewn into the jacket's collar, the one he discovered after the excavation, the one written in Captain Black's handwriting, addressed to no one. She died getting me out. I promised her I'd keep it safe. I promised I'd wait until the world was ready to remember her name. I kept my promise. I just ran out of time. Julian folded the letter carefully and placed it back inside the jacket. The Smithsonian requested the jacket for their collection. Julian agreed on one condition: that Maria Conti's name be displayed next to Captain Black's, that her story be told, that she not be forgotten. The jacket arrived at the Smithsonian 3 months after the discovery. Julian stood in the conservation lab, watching as specialists in white gloves carefully positioned it inside a climate-controlled display case. The blood chit was mounted beside it, the coordinates and lipstick stain visible under museum lighting. A placard beneath read, Captain Alistair Black, USAAF, 1918-2023. Maria Conti, Italian Resistance, 1921-1944. Some promises take a lifetime to keep. Julian stared at the display for a long time. The leather looked different here. Not trash, not forgotten, but sacred. A relic of love and war and sacrifice that had waited 8 decades to speak. Dr. Holt appeared beside him, hands in his pockets. You did good, kid. Julian nodded, but something still bothered him. Why didn't he ever come back? Julian asked quietly. Captain Black. He knew where the art was. He could have returned to Florence any time after the war. Why wait until he died? Dr. Holt was silent for a moment. Maybe he was afraid. Maybe he thought if he came forward, they'd ask questions he didn't want to answer. Or maybe he paused. Maybe returning would have meant facing what he'd lost. And he couldn't do that. Julian thought about the letter, the promise. He loved her that much. Enough to carry her secret for 79 years. Dr. Holt said, That's not cowardice. That's devotion. The Italian government held a ceremony in Florence 6 months later. They unveiled a memorial in the Piazza della Signoria, a bronze statue of a woman holding a painting, her face turned toward the sky. Beneath it, an inscription, Maria Conti, 1921 to 1944. She saved what they tried to destroy. Julian attended. So did Dr. Holt. So did representatives from the Smithsonian, the National Archives, and a dozen international art organizations. But the person Julian noticed most was an old woman sitting in the front row, her hands folded in her lap, tears streaming down her face. After the ceremony, Julian approached her. "Excuse me, did you know Maria Conti?" The woman looked up at him with eyes that had seen too much. "I was her sister," she said softly. "Lucia." Julian's breath caught. "I didn't know she had a sister. Most people didn't. I was 12 when she died. My parents sent me away before the bombing. I survived. She didn't." Lucia reached into her purse and pulled out a small, faded photograph. Maria, younger, smiling, standing in front of a painting. She loved art more than anything. She used to say that beauty was the only thing worth dying for. Lucia's voice cracked. "I thought she was foolish. I thought she wasted her life." She looked up at the statue. "I was wrong." Julian knelt beside her chair. "She didn't waste anything. She saved it, all of it. And because of her, the world gets to see what the Nazis tried to erase." Lucia wiped her eyes. "The American, the pilot, did he care for her?" Julian thought about the initials carved into the jacket, the lipstick stain, the letter. He loved her, and he kept his promise. Lucia smiled, small and sad. Then she didn't die alone. Back in the United States, Julian returned to his graduate studies. But the jacket, the story, stayed with him. He changed his thesis focus, wrote about forgotten veterans, about the invisible battles fought after the uniforms came off, about the weight of promises kept in silence. His advisor called it the best work she'd ever seen from a graduate student. "You're not just writing history," she told him. "You're honoring it." Julian submitted the thesis in the spring, defended it in front of a panel of professors who listened in silence, some wiping their eyes by the end. He graduated with honors, but more than that, he graduated with purpose. A year after the discovery, Julian received a package in the mail. No return address. Just his name, written in careful handwriting. Inside was a small wooden box. He opened it slowly. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, was a medal, tarnished silver, a ribbon faded to grey, the Distinguished Service Cross, and beneath it, a note. This belonged to Captain Black. It was never officially awarded. He refused it, said he didn't deserve it. But I think he did, and I think you should have it. Thank you for telling his story. Thank you for remembering her. Dr. Raymond Holt. Julian held the medal in his hand, feeling the weight of it. The weight of a life lived in silence. The weight of a love that outlasted death. He placed it on his desk, next to the photograph of Maria Conti he'd printed and framed. And he made a promise of his own, to keep telling these stories, to keep honoring the ones who served, who sacrificed, who loved and lost, and carried their burdens alone, because every life holds a story worth remembering. 2 years later, Julian published a book, The Jacket, a love story hidden in leather. It became a bestseller, not because of the art, not because of the treasure, but because of the people. Captain Alistair Black, Maria Conti, two souls caught in the machinery of war, who chose love over survival, memory over safety, silence over recognition. The book tour took Julian across the country. He spoke at universities, libraries, veterans' halls, and everywhere he went, people came up to him with their own stories, their own forgotten jackets, their own hidden promises. An elderly man in Ohio showed him a letter his father had written during the Korean War but never sent. A woman in Texas brought him a purple heart she'd found in her grandfather's attic, never knowing he'd been wounded. A veteran in California handed him a photograph of a woman he'd loved in Vietnam, a woman whose name he'd never spoken aloud until that moment. Julian listened to every story, wrote down every name, because that's what mattered. Not the treasure, the memory. If this story touched your heart, click like and subscribe to honor those who served. 3 years after the discovery, Julian returned to Florence. Not for a ceremony, not for an interview, just to visit. He stood in front of the memorial statue, the bronze woman holding her painting, her face turned toward the sky. The piazza was quiet. Tourists passed by, some stopping to read the inscription, others walking on without noticing. Julian placed a single white rose at the base of the statue. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for showing him, for trusting him, for saving what they tried to destroy." He stood there for a long time, the Italian sun warm on his face, the sounds of the city humming around him, and then he heard a voice. "You're the one who found the jacket." Julian turned. A young woman stood behind him, maybe 25, with dark hair and eyes that looked familiar. "I am," Julian said. She smiled. "I'm Sofia Conti, Maria's great niece. My grandmother Lucia told me about you before she passed. She said you gave Maria her name back." Julian's throat tightened. "I just told the truth." Sofia shook her head. "You did more than that. You made people remember, and in a world that forgets so easily, that's everything." She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, leather-bound journal. "This was Maria's. My grandmother kept it all these years. She wanted you to have it." Julian took the journal carefully, his hands trembling. "Are you sure?" "She wrote about him," Sofia said softly. "The American pilot. She called him Il mio cielo, my sky. She knew she was going to die. She knew the building would be bombed. But she went back anyway, to show him where the art was hidden, because she believed some things are worth dying for." Julian opened the journal. The pages were yellowed, the ink faded, but the words were still legible. And there, on the last page, dated September 10th, 1944, 2 days before she died, Maria had written, "If I do not survive, I hope he does. I hope he lives a long life. I hope he finds peace. And I hope someday someone will understand why we did this. Not for glory, not for recognition, but because beauty, true beauty, is the only thing that survives us. It is the only thing worth saving." Julian closed the journal, tears streaming down his face. Sofia placed a hand on his shoulder. "Thank you," she said, "for bringing them back together." Julian returned to the United States with the journal. He donated it to the Smithsonian, where it was placed in the display case next to the jacket and the bloodshed. But before he did, he made copies of every page. He read them over and over, Maria's words, her thoughts, her love, and he realized something. Captain Alistair Black didn't keep the secret because he was afraid. He kept it because he was honoring her. She had died to protect the art, to protect the truth, and he had lived to make sure her sacrifice wasn't forgotten. He had carried her memory in that jacket, sewn into the leather, hidden against his heart for 79 years. Not because he was ashamed, but because he was faithful. On the 5th anniversary of the discovery, the Smithsonian held a special exhibition, Hidden Histories, the Stories We Carry. The jacket was the centerpiece, but surrounding it were dozens of other items. Letters, medals, photographs, uniforms, each one representing a life, a story, a promise kept in silence. Julian walked through the exhibition slowly, reading every placard, studying every face, and he thought about all the people who had come to him over the years, all the forgotten veterans, all the hidden loves, all the silent sacrifices. He thought about Captain Black, dying alone in a nursing home, the jacket folded in a box beside his bed, waiting for someone to understand. He thought about Maria, standing in the rubble of her family's home, handing a piece of silk to a man she barely knew, trusting him with everything. And he thought about the jacket itself, how it had hung on a wire hanger in the back of a warehouse, ignored, unwanted, seconds away from being thrown in the trash. How one moment of curiosity, one decision to look closer, had changed everything. Julian stood in front of the display case one last time before the exhibition opened to the public. The jacket looked different now. Not old, not forgotten, timeless. Dr. Holt appeared beside him. "You ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't been there that day?" he asked. "If you hadn't asked to see the jacket?" Julian nodded. "Every day. It would have been thrown away. The bloodshit destroyed. The art lost forever. Maria forgotten. Captain Black's promise broken." Julian looked at the jacket, at the initials carved into the cuff, at the lipstick stain on the silk. "But I was there," he said quietly, "and I asked." Dr. Holt smiled. "That's the thing about history. It doesn't just happen. It's chosen by people who care enough to look closer, to ask questions, to refuse to let the forgotten stay forgotten." He placed a hand on Julian's shoulder. "You didn't just find a jacket, Julian. You found them, and you brought them home." The exhibition opened to the public the next day. Thousands of people came. They stood in front of the jacket reading the story, wiping their eyes, taking photographs. And many of them left with a new understanding. That history isn't just about the wars we win or the battles we fight. It's about the people we love, the promises we keep, the sacrifices we make in silence. It's about the jacket that nobody wanted, hanging in the back of a warehouse, waiting for someone to see its worth, waiting for someone to check the inner pocket. If you believe every life holds a story worth remembering, subscribe to this channel and join our community. 10 years after the discovery, Julian returned to the Veterans Nursing Home where Captain Alistair Black had died. It was a small facility outside Richmond, Virginia. Quiet, clean, but impersonal. He asked to see the room where Captain Black had lived his final years. The director, a kind woman in her 50s, led him down a long hallway. "Room 14, she said, unlocking the door. "We've had 3 residents since Captain Black, but I remember him." "You do?" She nodded. "He was quiet, kept to himself, never had visitors. But every night, before bed, he'd take out this old jacket and just hold it. Sometimes he'd talk to it. I thought maybe he was losing his mind." She paused. "But after your discovery, after the news broke, I understood. He wasn't losing his mind. He was keeping a promise." Julian stepped into the room. It was small, a bed, a chair, a window overlooking a parking lot. This was where Captain Black had spent his final years. Alone, but not empty, because he had carried Maria with him. Every day, every night, in the leather, in the silk, in the coordinates and the lipstick stain. He had carried her until he couldn't carry her anymore. And then he had trusted the world to find her. Julian stood in the center of the room, imagining the old man sitting in the chair, the jacket in his lap, whispering to a woman who had been dead for 79 years. "I kept my promise, Maria. I kept it." Julian left the nursing home and drove to the cemetery where Captain Black was buried. It was a small veteran cemetery, rows of white headstones stretching across a green hill. He found the grave easily. Captain Alistair Black, 1918-2023, USAAF. He kept his promise. Julian knelt beside the headstone and placed a photograph on the grass. Maria Conti, smiling, standing in front of a painting. "She's not forgotten," Julian said quietly. "Neither of you are." He stayed there for a long time, the wind rustling through the trees, the sun setting behind the hill, and he thought about the jacket, about how something so ordinary, so overlooked, had held a story powerful enough to change the world, about how love, real love, doesn't need recognition. It just needs to be kept. Julian published a second book 5 years later, The Promise, Love, War, and the Jacket That Waited 79 Years. It became required reading in history courses across the country, not because it was about art, but because it was about us, about the things we carry, the promises we keep, the people we refuse to forget. Julian received letters from readers all over the world. A woman in France wrote to tell him about her grandfather, a resistance fighter who had died protecting a Jewish family. A man in Germany sent him a photograph of his great-uncle, a soldier who had deserted the Nazi army and spent the rest of his life in hiding. A veteran in Australia mailed him a medal he'd never worn, saying he didn't deserve it, but maybe someone else did. Julian read every letter, responded to every one, because that's what Captain Black had taught him, that every story matters, that every life holds weight, that silence is not the same as insignificance. 20 years after the discovery, Julian stood on a stage in Washington, D.C., accepting the National Humanities Medal. The president shook his hand. The audience applauded, but Julian's mind was somewhere else. In a warehouse in Virginia, staring at a jacket nobody wanted. In a basement in Florence, watching a Caravaggio emerge from the darkness. In a nursing home room, imagining an old man holding a piece of leather like it was the only thing keeping him alive. When the applause died down, Julian stepped to the microphone. "I didn't do anything extraordinary," he said. "I just asked to see a jacket. I just looked a little closer. And because of that, two people who loved each other, two people the world had forgotten, got to be remembered." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. Captain Alistair Black and Maria Conti didn't ask for recognition. They didn't ask for medals or statues or books. They just asked to be seen, to be known, to matter. He looked out at the audience, and they did. They do, because someone cared enough to look. The room was silent. "So, if you take anything from this," Julian said, "take this. Look closer. Ask questions. Don't let the forgotten stay forgotten. Because the world is full of jackets hanging in warehouses, waiting for someone to check the inner pocket." Julian stepped down from the stage to a standing ovation. But the person he wished was there, the person he wanted to see this, was Captain Black, the man who had carried a promise for 79 years, the man who had died alone, believing no one would ever understand. Julian looked up at the ceiling, blinking back tears. "I understand now," he thought. "I understand." 30 years after the discovery, Julian was invited back to Florence. The city had built a museum dedicated to the recovered art. Every piece that had been hidden in that basement was now on display, restored and protected, and in the center of the museum, in a glass case of its own, was the jacket, on loan from the Smithsonian. Julian stood in front of it, older now, grey in his hair, lines in his face, but his eyes were the same, still searching, still honoring, still refusing to forget. A young girl, maybe 10 years old, stood beside him, staring at the jacket. "Why is it here?" she asked. "It's just a jacket." Julian smiled. "It's not just a jacket," he said. "It's a promise. It's a love story. It's proof that some things are worth keeping, even when the world tells you to throw them away." The girl looked up at him. Did he really wait his whole life? He did. Why? Julian knelt down so he was eye level with her. Because love isn't about being together. It's about being faithful. And Captain Black was faithful until the very end. The girl thought about this for a moment. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. "My grandpa gave me this before he died," she said. "He told me to keep it safe. I don't know why." She handed it to Julian. He unfolded it carefully. It was a letter, old, faded, and at the bottom, a signature. Captain Alistair Black. Julian's hands trembled. "Where did your grandpa get this?" "He said a man gave it to him a long time ago, in a hospital. He said the man told him to keep it until someone asked. Julian read the letter. It was addressed to no one and everyone. If you're reading this, it means I'm gone. It means the jacket was found. It means Maria's story is known. Thank you. Thank you for caring. Thank you for looking. Thank you for keeping the promise I couldn't keep alone. A.B. Julian folded the letter carefully and handed it back to the girl. Keep it safe, he said, his voice breaking. It's important. She nodded and put it back in her pocket, and then she walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Julian stood alone in front of the jacket, tears streaming down his face. You're welcome, he whispered. You're welcome, Captain. Julian lived another 20 years. He wrote 5 more books, gave hundreds of lectures, helped recover dozens of forgotten stories. But the jacket, the story of Captain Black and Maria Conti, remained his greatest work, not because of the art, not because of the treasure, but because it proved something the world needed to hear, that love endures, that promises matter, that no life, no sacrifice is ever truly forgotten, as long as someone cares enough to look. When Julian died at the age of 73, he was buried in the same veteran cemetery as Captain Black. His headstone read, Julian Reeves, 2003-2006. He looked closer, and beside his grave, someone, no one knew who, placed a single white rose and a photograph. Captain Alistair Black and Maria Conti, together at last.